teachers are tired of being undervalued, underpaid, and straight out disrespected. Before the pandemic, kids would read, kids would mostly pay attention in class. Post-pandemic, all of that is out of the window. So like, teaching through the pandemic is traumatic. Teaching after the pandemic is traumatic. Teaching in general is traumatic.
What were some of the new responsibilities that you got that nobody really recognized?
Hey everyone, my name is Adam Khan, and this is the podcast called STEM for Them. Thank you guys for joining us, and today we have an amazing guest. Her name is Lacey. She is a middle school teacher in the Gwinnett County District, talking about pre-pandemic versus post-pandemic teaching and what the difference was when it comes to helping these kids find where they belong. On top of that, we talk about what the struggles are of a teacher, which we all know is underfunded, short-staffed, and has many other conflicts that we focus on. On another note, we got merch coming out. We have not released it yet, but it will be coming out soon. Thank you guys for your patience. I know this has been a long journey throughout this, but you guys have been really patient, and I cannot have asked for a better audience. So again, thank you for joining us on this podcast. So as I always say, silence that background noise, as it says on the shirt. Now let's get to it.
Well, it's good seeing you again.
Yeah.
It's been a
good
minute
seeing you
too.
It's been so long, but it's so funny because I work with Tracy Sanker.
Yeah.
Like, she's my teammate, and she's like, I'm going to play pickleball with Adam. And I was like, Adam Khan? And she's like, yeah, who else? I was like, that's so fun. Tell him I said hi.
Yeah. Pickleball is a lot of fun. I don't know if you ever tried it or
We did like this thing where like over the summer for summer school, we all went and she like taught us how to play, and we were all, of course, really bad at it. But Tracy's like out there like killing it, you know?
Yeah. Okay, cool. So Lacey, we got you on the podcast now, STEM for Them podcast. And so we brought you on here, and I just wanted you to kind of tell your story a little bit and what you do currently.
Well, my name is Lacey, and I'm currently a teacher at in Gwinnett County Public Schools. I teach 7th grade life science, and it's kind of weird to like teach in the school system that you went through. Cause like we went to Parkview together, and like, you know, we went through Gwinnett County schools and everything. And then like seeing it from the other side of it is interesting and like kind of weird. And you're like, ooh, there's a lot of weird things going on here. Or you're like, wow, this is really great. Or you're like, wow, I didn't know all of that. But it's definitely been a journey.
Yeah, it has been a journey so far. And it's funny that you say that, because I didn't even think about how you went through the, you know, public school system, specifically this county, and then you are now a teacher in that county.
Right. And there's a lot of people who do that same thing, who are like, they go to school in Gwinnett County and then they go back into this circle of like, oh, now I'm back. And a lot of people actually go back to the district that they went to. Like, I remember when we were at Parkview, there were a lot of teachers that had gone to Parkview and ended up back up at there. And I was like, why would you teach at the same school you went to?
Yeah.
And now here I am teaching, not in the same cluster, but
Sure.
very close to where I grew up.
Why is that the case though?
Well, the real reason of why I ended up where I am is, so I teach in the Brookwood cluster.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was doing my student teaching at Georgia State, they had us fill out a form of like what grade level we preferred to do, like what were we majoring in kind of, and I was middle grades, so like middle school. And I really was just looking at what schools are closest to my parents' house, because that's where I thought I was going to be living at the time. And I was like, well, I don't want to do my student teaching at Trickham, because then I have to see my old teachers, and that's weird. And so I was like, okay, the next closest one is Five Forks. So I picked that one, put it as my number one. And then I think Duluth Middle School was my second one. Ended up getting placed at Five Forks, did my student teaching there. Loved it. Was with a great mentor teacher. Administration and I really got along. And then I had my interview, got hired, and I've been there for 3 years. So that's why I ended up as close to Parkview as I am. It's just because that's just how it happened.
Yeah, but it's good that it's full circle.
Yeah.
You know, I've seen some people where they start off in their hometown and they go like completely opposite because they've had some traumatic experience.
Right.
Like, which happens very often, right?
Mhm.
I mean, so it's good that you're back in the community that you grew up in, and you know more about it though.
Right.
That's a very different part of understanding really where you come from, because you know the insides, you know
Yeah.
what the public system's like, and you know specifically what your public system's like.
Right.
So you can make a bigger change when you understand what hoops you got to go through.
Exactly.
So it's good to hear that you're finally into that. Did you know that you were going into middle school, teaching, or was it a little bit different for you during that
No,
process?
I knew I was going
Hmm.
into middle school from very early on. Like, I used to be a nursing major. Like when I went to Georgia State, I was like, I'm gonna be a nurse. I was so excited. And I was like, I'm gonna be a nurse. And everybody was like, oh my God, that's so great. You'll make such a difference, going into another service profession. Um, and then I took a chemistry class that like kicked my so I
Yeah.
had to change my major. So I changed it to education. And when considering like what grade level I was going to teach, I was like, I can't do kids. Can't do little kids. Like, do not want to teach elementary school. And I considered teaching high school, but at that time I was like 21. And it was just weird to be like, okay, what if I end up teaching seniors? Like, then I'm literally 4 years older than them. And that's just too crazy for me. So then I settled on middle school. I was like, all right, let's see how this goes. And I could not imagine myself in any other grade level.
Yeah, and that's a good thing too, right?
Right.
That's important to see. So I actually didn't even know that, and that's I just remembered that you bringing it up. So you were in nursing at first at Georgia State,
Mm-hmm.
and so that chemistry class just wasn't your taste.
Was not my thing. Like, I
Yeah.
had been pretty good at science up until then. And I love chemistry. Like, I taught physical science with 8th graders for the first 2 years of teaching. And I always loved the semester with chemistry because it's just so fun and there's like a reason for everything, But organic chemistry for me, I was like, there is no concrete anything for me to tie down to. Like, this is all. I was like, is this even real? Like, you're telling me about these ethyls and methyls and all these things that have these crazy names. I was like, I just remember like that class was like an hour and 15 minutes. And I would walk out of there every time. Like, I could not tell you what just happened in that class if my life depended on it.
Yeah,
Like-
it's. I mean, well, you're looking at molecules, right? That
Right.
you can't see. First of all, you're looking at it from a textbook,
Right.
and then you're expected to be like, "Oh, that's oxygen." Okay.
Right. And like having to draw it was one thing. I was like, okay, I know that like hydrogen bonds to everything, but like that was about it. And then like I had this professor who would like upload videos and she would like she was so thorough. And I appreciated all of her work and I was like, this isn't making sense. Like, what do I do?
Yep.
Like, the only reason I think that I passed that class was because Georgia State combines your lab and your lecture grade. And so I had like a 103 in lab, but I had like a D in lecture. So I was like flying by the seat of my pants. It was bad, but I didn't change my major till after the withdrawal date. So I had to stay in the class.
Yeah, well, that's very unfortunate.
Yeah.
So then once you did that, right, how did you just go into teaching? What sparked you to figure out your way after you realized, hey, nursing is not mine?
I had always, like, even from when I was a little kid, I always knew I wanted to do something where I was going to like help people.
Mm-hmm.
And like I was like that kid that played school, like in my bedroom as a kid, like I would line my stuffed animals up and like have little worksheets that I made and like whatever. And it took me a really long time to like kind of remember that and remember that I had this like passion for teaching or like passion for helping other people. And then it was kind of like thinking about my family and my dad's side of the family is like all teachers. All the women are teachers or had been teachers in some way, shape, or form. And so kind of remembering all that, once I got into education, it was like, okay, this is where I'm supposed to be. This makes more sense. Well, let's see how this goes.
Right. And so going back to that, in your parents, cultural background or, their educational background, what was it like for them? What were they both in careers of?
So I'm mixed race. My
Mhm.
mom is Chinese. My dad is white. My dad went to Georgia Tech and got a bachelor's degree in like applied psychology or something that you like wouldn't think of somebody going to Georgia Tech for. I think he was like originally electrical engineering and hated it, so he changed. And And then my mom went to Agnes Scott, and I want to say she did like economics or something.
Okay.
But my dad was always like, you definitely should go to college. Like, both my parents were very supportive of our family going to post-secondary education and all of that. My dad especially, like, he really encouraged us to like pursue something we really wanted to do, but also would be able to like support our families in the future, like all of that. But it's definitely different because I do have some friends like you who are first generation, who like don't have parents who have that kind of background and who are able to give guidance in that regard. So I definitely felt like pressure in a way to go to school, but I did not necessarily feel like, oh my God, I have to, because I'm the only one in my family that's gone to this, you know?
Yeah, that's so important though, right? That pressure can make or break you
Right.
sometimes. So it's good that you had the option, right? Like the flexibility to choose if school isn't for you.
Right.
And now it's different. It's funny, like it's full circle because not only is school for you, you're teaching
Right.
a schooling
Right.
method. So
Yeah.
it's funny to see that, you know?
Right.
But that's interesting though, right? So when you found out that you wanted to go through basically teaching in middle school, how did you go about that? You're at Georgia State now, and you're basically in a different position because you want to
Right.
change your majors. You know, so how to walk us through basically how you went from there.
So after that, I had to take like my basic like intro level education courses. So like before you take your major and before you get assigned to your cohort. So you take like all these silly classes about like educational theory and like history of education, and you talk about the difference between like charter schools, private schools, public schools, that kind of thing. And you talk about like pedagogy, which is like all the stuff behind why we teach the way that we do, kind of thing. It's
Gotcha.
like or like the art of teaching is that big fancy word for it. And so it's a lot of that, but it's very surface level, and it kind of like dips your toe into like what the culture of education is at Georgia State. And then before your like the summer before junior year, you apply to the education program. You go through like an interview, and you know, do some other stuff. It's formal, but you have to like really not be great to not get in. And so after that, you kind of like meet all your cohort people, and then you start to take some other classes where you're with your cohort like all the time, which is really nice because you get to have a group of other people who are going through the same thing as you for
Right.
2 years. So if you need to complain to them, you can complain to them. You have a lot of really good friends, but then you also learn about like some of these people are going to be awesome teachers. Some of these people should not be teachers, you know? So it's just kind of interesting.
So when you go through that, right, you
Mhm.
went through the whole process of learning about, you know, what you want to do now into that field, but how did you figure out the major for what teaching was?
I mean, they kind of just like line it up real simple for you in college. Like there's only one degree for teaching.
Oh,
It's
okay.
just education. I mean, actually, there's a couple different paths you could take. So when I was working on changing my major, the lady who was in the advisement office was like, okay, there's a couple different paths you could take. Depends on what you want to teach. I was like, okay. At that time, I really wanted to teach math. Right now, I do not want to teach math. Do not ever put me in a math classroom ever again. But she had told me that I could either major in education with a concentration in math or something else, because when you're education middle grades, you pick 2 concentrations because most middle school teachers are certified in 2 content areas. So like I'm certified in science and math. And sometimes you get to choose what you teach, sometimes you don't. Depends on what school you go to and what's open. Elementary school teachers, you teach everything. High school teachers are very specialized. And so she told me that if I had wanted to teach high school math, that I would have to major in math and have a minor in education. And I was like, okay, I like math, but I don't know that I like it enough to major in it. 'Cause
Yeah.
there's a lot of like upper level courses that you have to take. And There was a guy in my cohort who had done that. He was like, I've taken so many math courses at this point, I might as well teach it. So then he went into education. He had taken like calculus up to like, I don't know how many variables, but way
Yeah.
too many for a normal person who
Yeah.
is not going to teach math. So he went in and he was like super cool. It was great. He was very fun.
Wow, I didn't know that you had to specialize. It's basically specializing. That's
Mhm.
what it is. So,
Yeah.
And once you're in it, you're in it.
You're kind of
Yeah.
in it. Like, yeah.
So when you did yours, for instance, you're a middle school teacher. So did
Mhm.
you have to have anything on top of your bachelor's?
No. Oh wait, yes, I did. Sorry. You get your bachelor's, you graduate, and then you're like, okay, great, I'm a teacher. And then the state of Georgia is like, no, you're not. You have to go and take all these tests. And we didn't tell you that they cost money. So before you graduate, let me rewind a
Yeah,
little
you
bit
go
here. There's this big, horrendous thing called the EdTPA.
Okay.
And it
All right.
is a thing that should be set on fire. And it is like, it was my own personal hell, honestly.
Oh my God.
It's, so you know, like Pearson,
Yeah.
who like makes all the textbooks and like all the educational whatever. They have like a monopoly on educational like everything. So Pearson makes the EdTPA and then like sells it to a bunch of colleges and universities and is like, everybody in the country has to pass this in order to become a teacher, like in order to graduate. So you have to pass the EdTPA. Some random panel of people judge these ridiculous lesson plans that you have to make. And you have to film yourself teaching, but you're only allowed to submit up to 10 minutes of footage. So they literally judge whether or not you're going to get your degree based on 10 minutes of you teaching. You have to write like all this like buzzwordy bullshit of like, at minute 5 and 37 seconds, my students were engaging in collaborative learning and blah, 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 you know? But like Georgia State's program is built on getting students to pass the EdTPA. So like everything they make you do in student teaching, whether it's lesson plans or whatever, is so that you can pass the EdTPA. So like the lesson plans that I had to make in college were like 10, 12 pages, single spaced, like ridiculous. And I remember the first one I turned into my mentor teacher because they had told us like, you have to submit these to your mentor by this time so that your mentor knows like what you're teaching, blah, 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 blah. And my mentor teacher was like, what is this? I've never seen a lesson plan that looks like this. I'm so glad I don't have to make lesson plans that look like this. And now that I'm not in college anymore, I don't make lesson plans that look like that anymore. My lesson plans are on a sticky note. Just says to do. And I'm at a school where I'm not required to turn in my lesson plans. There are a lot of schools, typically lower performing schools, where they make their teachers turn in a week's worth of lesson plans like Monday or the Friday before that week. And then they get like feedback on it. It's really weird. It's just has nothing to do with supporting student achievement or anything like that, or like teacher effectiveness. It's all about like, you have to be lockstep in so that our test scores can look better, kind of that thing.
Huh.
But with EdTPA, you have to submit like a week's worth of lessons for like a whole unit. And they have to be, you're given like this binder that's literally like this thick, and it has all the rubrics for like what these rando people are going to grade you on. And it's kind of like if you're really good at like finessing the system, you'll pass EdTPA. And everybody's like, just go by the rubric, blah, blah, blah. It's like, if you put all the buzzwords in there and you make it sound like half decent, you'll be all right. But it's like, it's horrible because the whole thing, you have to upload it in like 3 different parts. And I think when I put everything together, it was like 70 pages of stuff. So you have to do the EdTPA. Once you pass your EdTPA, you get your degree, you graduate, whatever. Then you have to take these tests called the GACE. They're like the Georgia something certification exams, I think. And you take one for each content area that you're in. And you take it. So like I've taken the science one and the math one. And it basically just goes over like basic science stuff up to like high school science stuff or whatever. And then they give you a score. And if you pass it with a certain threshold, then you're fine. And it goes on your like teaching license, and everybody can, it's like public information. So like you could literally look my teaching license up and see what Lacey Krakowiak is certified in. But other than that, I'm pretty sure that those are the only things that you have to have on top of your bachelor's degree. But if I wanted to go and get certified in something else, I'd have to take another test.
That sounds like it's a lot of.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. It is a lot of.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
is.
because it's like at some point you're just continuing to take exams and spend
Uh-huh.
money on a test.
Yeah,
Like
and the
you said.
GACE, they're not cheap. They're like $300 a test.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's insane.
Yeah.
And so they don't provide any, obviously, financial assistance or anything
No,
like that.
actually, it depends on your school. I got ESOL certified.
Okay.
And if people don't know what ESOL means,
Yeah.
it's like English as a second or other language. So like kids who speak other languages at home learning English, or you weren't born in this country, so they kind of automatically throw you in the ESOL program. So I got ESOL certified because my school did not have enough support for the kids who are ELL, English language learners. And the test for that, I got reimbursed for the study materials that I purchased and for the test that I took. So I got like my $450 back. But a lot of people have to just spend that and they never see it again.
What are the requirements like that each school, basically waives that fee? Is it also the same situation where it's a higher ranked school that they'll be able to do that?
Kind of. It really depends on if the school has enough money.
Okay.
So like, or if your administration is like offering a stipend. Like my administration was like, we will pay for you to get certified. Like we'll pay for your study
Wow.
materials. We'll pay for you to take the test. We just need people to get certified. And I was like, okay, whatever. I'm teaching these kids anyway. Might as well get certified and get my money for it. But then other places, like when I took physical science, it's technically a high school level course in Gwinnett County. So you have to get like another certification on top of your regular middle school science certification. So I had to take the middle school science test and then like the general like grades 6 through 12 science test. And I didn't get paid back for that one.
Wow, look at that.
Yeah.
That's so weird.
It is.
What a weird way to put it. So nobody told you about this, I assume, like when you started going into the teaching field of like what exams were left.
No. It's like, it's a real pain in the ass. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Because like I'm a student teacher. I'm trying to figure out, okay, how the hell do I get certified after I graduate? Like, what's the deal here? And there's places to find answers. You're like, all of you are certified, so somebody has to have an answer here. And then like you go to people and they're like, well, I got certified like 20 years ago, so I don't really remember. And everything's changed since then. So it's like, okay, well, now what? So like, it was really just a lot of Googling and a lot of like asking different people until you got like some sort of similar answer, I guess. But yeah, people are either like super helpful or they're completely unhelpful. There's no in between.
Yeah. And that sounds about right because you're right. Like the teaching field is changing every year.
Right.
It's not just like all of a sudden.
It changes all the time.
Yeah.
It changes from county to county within a state, and then it changes from state to state.
Yep.
And it's so weird. And I feel like people being helpful or unhelpful and with certification also probably goes along with like, I would imagine probably medical school or anything like that, or any other field that you have to be certified in. So it's just like, you'd think they would make these things easier for people, but they don't.
Yeah, no, that's a good point you make. And that's kind of where I have a weird thought about, like there's always a physician shortage. There's always a teacher shortage. Anything you could think of shortage.
Right.
They're always changing some of the rules. And that's always another excuse or another reason why there is a shortage, because people don't want to deal with this anymore.
Yeah. And that's kind of a big reason of why there's this national teacher shortage. I mean, apparently, I know there's like a nursing shortage. There's all these shortages, egg shortages, all this other stuff, but especially with the teacher shortage, like I personally, for a third year teacher, I'm making pretty okay money. In the state of Georgia pays its teachers pretty well. And Gwinnett County is one of the highest paying districts in the state. So you have to jump through a lot of hoops, but it's like, okay, I'm getting paid this much money. Plus, Kemp keeps throwing money at us. And I'm like, okay, I'll take it. Give me my raise. But then it goes along with, like, it's not just the money. Because everybody tells you when you go into teaching, are you sure you want to be a teacher? You don't make any money. And then everybody tells you, well, you do it for the kids, blah, 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 blah. There's a lot of toxic positivity in teaching, and just in education in general. And there's a lot of people who are out of touch and who don't understand truly what teachers go through on a day-to-day basis. So at different schools, it really, like, the Parkview district is great. The Brookwood district is great. The schools within the district, it depends. So, like, if you're a parent sending your kid to Trickham Middle School, one parent may say one thing, one parent says something else. Okay. It depends on what demographic your kid is. It depends on what ability, grade level they have, whatever. But then as a teacher, depends on what kind of coworkers you have, depends on what kind of administration you have, what kind of principal you have, what kind of parents and kids are enrolled at your school. And there's a lot of factors. And I will say my school, I've got it pretty good. Like, there are a lot of places that teachers are where it's really shitty. And I could have so much worse of, like, an environment to work in. Doesn't mean that I, like, I don't have shitty days as a teacher.
Right.
But, like, I have significantly less shitty days than, like, some people who work in really crazy schools, you know? But, like, right now I have the most supportive administration. Wouldn't want to go anywhere else. My school's pretty small-ish, even though I have, like, a bajillion kids in my class periods. But yeah, it really depends on kind of where you go, because everything is different. It's just interesting that there's no, like, uniformity anywhere. And if there is any uniformity, it's all on paper. There's no uniformity, like, really at all.
Right. And so why is that the case, though? I know that's hard to say, but do you think that a lot of the times it's because of the funding? Because just like you said, you know, the governor of Georgia is a little bit different because they're throwing money towards
Right.
your way in your district, though. But it's not the same in other places. So this shortage of teachers, you know, where is it coming from?
That's a really good question. I think it comes down to, like, what the head of your district's, like, overall outlook is on education. Like, when we were in school, it was what's his face? Will Banks, who was the superintendent of Gwinnett, right? He's been retired for a few years now. And we have this new guy who people kind of don't like. The board doesn't like him either. Sorry, I'm kind of, like, exposing the secrets of Gwinnett here, but
it's probably on public anyways. It's
no, it is
school.
out on public. It's all over Facebook. You could literally Google it and it'll come up.
Yeah.
But I think it comes down to teachers are really tired of being treated like and I think there's a lot of people in a lot of professions that are tired of being treated like shit. I will say I almost quit last year because the kids that I had were some of the worst kids that I've ever taught. And when you're in teacher school or teacher college or whatever you want to call it, your educational preparation program, there's a lot of toxic positivity there where you're like, all students deserve to have your best 100% of the time. All students deserve this. No student should be like blah, 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 blah. So you go into teaching, you're like, I can't hate a kid. I can't not like a kid, like whatever. And then you get that one kid where you're like, wow, I hate you, you know, and then you feel bad because you're like, they told me that I, like, can't like a kid. And I remember I told that to my mentor teacher. She was like, what are you talking about? Whatever they told you, that's not right. They're just trying to get it to where you're like, you get all like bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and you're like, oh my God, education is so amazing. And then they dump a bucket of cold water on you. Like, no, here's reality, you know?
Yeah.
But I think a lot of it is that teachers are tired of being undervalued, underpaid, and straight out disrespected by both administration. Some of the craziest stories I've ever heard are on, like, teacher Facebook groups of if you're like, oh my God, guys, I left my building crying today because my administrator said this ridiculous thing. And you're like, who who says that to somebody else?
Right.
Or like you have parents that don't support teachers and then go straight to administration. Especially it's worse if the administration doesn't support their teachers.
Mm.
Then you got the kids. So pre-pandemic, there were like, really great kids, and there were the kind of the middle kids, and then there's the kind of kids. Post-pandemic, they're all kind of so like, no, I'm
You're
so
right.
serious.
You're right. Yeah.
Like before the pandemic, there were a lot of, kids would read, kids would like mostly pay attention in class. If you had a kid on their phone, you could say, put your phone away, and they'd put it away. Post-pandemic, all of that is out of the window. So like teaching through the pandemic is traumatic. Teaching after the pandemic is traumatic. Teaching in general is traumatic. But there was a whole time, I think, like right last year, towards the end of last year, where there was just a slew of teachers leaving in droves from wherever and all the time. Like across the nation, it was just kind of like there had always kind of been a teacher shortage, but people were like, oh, there really is a teacher shortage, because people were just leaving. They were like, I'm over this. Like, I'm not getting paid enough. I'm being stepped on every day by these kids who don't respect anybody, not even themselves. And why should I, an adult who has 1, sometimes even 2 degrees, go and leave my workplace in tears?
Yeah.
Like that shouldn't happen. And like myself, I almost left last year because I had kids that were just like some of the most disrespectful kids I've ever interacted with, where I was like, what is wrong with y'all? And there's just a lot like that people don't know of what happens in a school every day. Especially being in America, like the mass shootings and all this other stuff. There's just a lot of baggage that comes with being a teacher that a lot of people are really tired of carrying around all the time. So they're like, you know what? F this. I'm out.
Right.
So I think that's why there's a teacher shortage, because people are pissed off and they're done.
It's a reality, though. I mean,
Yeah.
It's just like it's however you treat that profession, whatever profession it is.
Yep.
They're either gonna love you or they're gonna hate you.
Right.
That whatever those professionals are. And this is the situation with same with nurses. Nurses get treated like crap. They really do. And the teachers are a perfect example of this synonymous problem that both fields are having,
Right.
And you guys are taking care of humans,
Mhm.
obviously in a different circumstance than nurses, but it's the exact same problem. Nobody's listening to you guys. And then on top of that, you guys have to deal with your voices and just talk to each other about it. But that's it.
Right.
That's as far as it comes out to. So I can see why
Right.
the teacher shortage is insane right now.
Yeah. It's kind of one of those things where like you have those friends who like treat you like for a really long time, and then they're like genuinely surprised when you like ghost them or don't talk to them, and they're like, why did you leave? And it's like, why are you seriously asking me that right now? Like you literally walked all over me and you're surprised that I left?
Yeah.
That's kind of what it's like.
Great analogy.
Yeah.
I love it. I want to use that one.
Right.
But talking about the pandemic, I for some reason I completely like forgot about how important how vital it was for you. So when you were in that pandemic time of trying to teach kids, what were some of the new responsibilities that you got that nobody really recognized?
Oh my gosh, there's so many. So my first year teaching was 2020, 2021.
Mm-hmm.
So it was after everybody had like initially closed. It was when we started out doing digital and then eventually went back to hybrid. So I was teaching off of Zoom all day, every day. And they, most people know that as a teacher, you wear several different hats throughout the day. And I knew of some of those, but like sometimes you're like, okay, yeah, I'm going to be wearing a parent hat. I'm going to be the nurse. I'm going to be, a friend and all this other stuff. But it definitely changes once you get into some of those situations. Especially when you're dealing with kids who have to change the environment they're learning in like that so drastically.
Yeah, right.
Like I had kids where I was having to almost be like a mental health worker like every day because kids had really like a lot of struggles with their mental health and weren't sure how to deal with it, and their parents weren't sure how to deal with it either. Um and there were a lot of people who were kind of missing their friends at school, obviously, because you're just in your house. We had some kids who were kind of like in a normal school year would be the quiet kid who doesn't really talk to a whole lot of people, but like comes every day. But then when it came to digital learning, it was bad. It was like, you do not need to be at home by yourself kind of thing. Um,
Why is that? Like, what were some of the characteristics that they pulled out?
um, well, there are kids who just like wouldn't do anything because their parents work all day
Mhm.
or work several jobs, so they're the only ones at home. I had a kid who like would always be late to class, and I would be like, dude, why are you late to class every day? I found out from my team teacher that he was the oldest of his siblings, taking care of 3 other siblings who were all under the age of like 7. One of them was a baby, so he had to like literally carry his computer with him, make a bottle, go feed the baby, put the baby down for a nap because his parents were at work. So he's like, I taught 8th grade, so he's like 14, caring for all these other kids at home. The oldest one that they're all looking to, he basically was having to parent at the age of 14, which is like ridiculous. He doesn't know what to do. He's also a baby. Um, and so like having those really hard realizations is like every day is really taxing. Not only for you as a teacher, but it's like really hard developmentally for the kids because then they have to go through all this stuff, right? That they're not supposed to go through when they're 13, 14 years old. Plus, they're not getting the socialization from being in school. So, like, now coming back from the pandemic, now that we're all back in person and people are kind of like brushing off that COVID is like still a thing.
Right.
There's definitely like very lasting effects of COVID kids, like kids who go to school during and after the pandemic. Like, it's wild to me. They're mean to each other. They're mean to me. And it's just crazy. And it's just crazy.
So, like, that's so interesting. This is like a psychology part that
Right.
we're getting into, but I didn't even think about that, and I'm glad that you brought that up. But so the students come back in the sense, and they kind of lose their social
Yes.
behavior, right?
Yeah.
Before pandemic, they were very social with each other because they're kids.
Mhm.
Kids are sponges, you know?
Yes.
Then after COVID, when they finally come back, they're starting to realize that, or you're starting to realize that these kids' behaviors of socialization, they're just not up to par because of they lost it in those 2
Right.
years, right?
Yeah.
And that's huge because you're right, they're developing. These kids over here, they're not fully formed like you and I, and even you and I in our
We're not
situations.
fully developed adults either. Like,
But the same thing would happen
Right.
to us too as adults. So
Right.
imagine what that's already doing to a kid who's growing, he or
Right.
she. That's insane.
yeah.
I didn't even know, like, I didn't even think about that. That's another problem that you guys are dealing with.
Yeah, it's wild. Like, plus these kids, like, you're right, they are sponges. But the kids now are like, they have social media, just another level on top of like the craziness that you already have to deal with when you work with kids.
Yep.
Like, I love my kids. They're great. Some of them I want to like, punch in the face a couple times a day.
Yeah.
But that's normal. But sometimes the things that I hear them say to one another or I hear them like talk about, I'm like, there's no way that you would know what that is if you
Right.
didn't have social media.
Right.
And it's just like kids trying to be so mature at such a young age. And it's just like, it almost makes you uncomfortable as an adult because like we didn't grow up with any of that. Like you and I grew up when like internet wasn't a thing, and then internet, and then like now we're here and like
Yeah.
internet rules all,
Right.
know? These kids have never grown up without a Wi-Fi connection.
Right.
So like I remember the first time I told a kid, I was like, Wi-Fi used to not be a thing, right? He's like, what? Like he had no idea. So adding that on top of like pandemic stuff, yeah, it's just a whole other animal.
Yeah. I mean, well, on top of that, right, you're not getting a paycheck for being a psychiatrist.
No,
But you
I'm
are.
not. But I am a
but
psychiatrist.
you just don't prescribe medications, but you're listening to all the problems that are
Right.
going on. and they're coming from the household, right? Like this is where it stems out, not to, gaslight the parents, but the parents are busy because they're worried about paying the bills.
Right. They're worried about paying the bills, but then there are a lot of parents who just like are not involved in their kids' education, or who truly, I'm just like, what was the point in you having a kid? Kind of is like, there are a lot of parents who want the kid and who are like, oh yeah, I have 3 kids, but they're not a parent,
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Like when you're a teacher, it's very easy to tell whose parents are involved and whose parents are not.
Right.
And it took me a while to like get comfortable with that, because I had really involved parents growing up. I don't know how your parents were when you were growing up, but my parents were like checking my grades all the time. Like they knew what was going on. They went to PTA meetings, they went to band concerts, they did all this other stuff. And so like growing up with that, it's very different when you're a teacher and you have to teach kids who don't have that, or who have never experienced anything like that. And so you have to fill kind of all these different roles of like, yeah, I'm like a therapist. Yeah, I'm a nurse because I give Band-Aids in my classroom all the time. Or like, yeah, I'm a counselor and I talk to kids about their feelings all day. But then I'm also like a parent many, many times throughout the day. And I'm like teaching these kids like basic skills where I'm like, why don't you know this? You should know how to act like around these kinds of people, but they don't, because their parents literally just don't teach that to them.
Right.
Like, parents don't parent.
Yeah,
know?
A lot of parents, they talk about how you take them to a private school, they'll do really good. You'll take them to a really good school in general, and they'll learn everything.
Right.
But when they come back home, that's where the teaching starts.
Right.
The teachers are just there to help you kind of get along, get the ball rolling, because there's only so much the teacher can do in an 8-hour period day, a 1-hour period, to be fair,
really,
of whatever subject it is, and then go from there. But the way they act, that all comes from that household. Right. And that's the scary part too, because you never know with these people out here. Like when I was growing up, like it's a good point that you make up about the PTAs and everything. My dad, my mom weren't able to be there because they were working. But at the same time, when it came to report cards, this and that, being supportive, they were there for that,
Right.
So it was more like, it's different, because for me, it wasn't that I wasn't getting the support, it was that my parents didn't have the time, and I figured it out myself, which is a positive thing for me.
Right.
And I'm glad for that. But if I wasn't in that situation where some of these parents you see, like option C, option C is that they're just there, hey, let me drop you off to school. There you go. Good luck. And then I'll come back and see you later.
Right.
That's how it ends up.
Well, and it's interesting that you bring up that like you figured it out on your own.
Right.
Because you're like a very resourceful human being.
Yeah. Yep.
Like you had the work ethic and the motivation to take kind of matters in your own hands and be like, okay, I know that my parents are going to support me as best they can because they're doing the best with what they've got, but I have to kind of pick up the slack here and there, right? I have a lot of kids who are the most unresourceful people I've ever met, where I'm like, y'all, you have got to figure it out. Otherwise, like some of these kids, I'm like, y'all are going to be leading our nation at one point or another. Like, this is horrifying, because some of them are really, really great. So I'm like, can I hold you back?
Yeah.
Do you want to stay here for like 7 more years and be like the model for what kids are supposed to do? And then there are a lot of kids where you're like, sweetie, no.
Yep.
Like, come on, let's figure it out, And so like you can tell whose parents are the ones who are like encouraging certain life skills and who are encouraging them to do X, Y, and Z, who are like the super resourceful, like very critical thinker kids. But then I have a lot of kids, and I mean, this was true before the pandemic too, but it's super, super evident after it, with like kids who are just very complacent with where they are and who are just super apathetic. And it's always interesting when we do parent-teacher conferences, because a lot of the times you're not having parent-teacher conferences with the kids who are doing what they're supposed to do. You're not having conferences with the parents whose kids are getting high grades. You're not getting the ones who are reading on the reading level or even above that. you're not conferencing with the high achiever parents. You're conferencing with the kids whose parents don't respond to emails, whose parents you can't get a hold of on the phone. It'll be a wonderful thing if they even show up to the conference, but it's always that their kid, either it's a behavior problem or it's a social problem, or it's that, hey, we're seeing a lack of effort in class and we'd just like to know kind of what your kid's kind of history is in school and blah, 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 blah. And then sometimes you meet the parent, you're like, oh, the apple indeed does not fall far from the tree. But then other times it's kind of like, okay, your parents are great. Like, what's the deal? It's like kind of like how my brother was. Like, my brother did not care about school. And my parents were like, we have tried literally everything. Like, we are trying so hard. We read to him at night and we do all this other stuff. And my parents were very involved. My brother just didn't care.
Right.
And some of these kids, they're like, school isn't my thing. And that's fine. But then some of these kids, it's like, school's not your thing and you're a piece. So it's like, you can't have both.
Yeah,
you gotta
exactly.
pick one. Either be. It's like, you talk to girls and like, you're like, you can't be a and be ugly. Like, you gotta pick one.
It's
kind of like how it is with kids. Like, you gotta pick one.
Exactly.
Figure it out.
Yep. Agreed. No, and it's funny that you bring that up because I've noticed that as well. Like with a lot of my classmates, my old classmates, you can tell a difference. And one of those differences that I've noticed trait-wise is how much money comes into that family household. That does make a difference. And
yes.
And it's funny. It actually goes the other way. Like you and I, we didn't grow up rich.
No.
I grew up in a situation where I was, not struggling for money, but we definitely had our toes on the line a lot of times. And because of that, that was my drive. There would be times where my high school teachers would come up and they would try to tell my parents, like, hey, like, this kid's not doing good. And I would be like, yeah, do you know where I was last night? Like, working.
Right.
to make
I'm
money.
12 working at my family business.
Yeah.
Like,
and I'm like, that's just how it was,
Right.
And like, luckily it wasn't that, bad where I was 12, but I was like 16, 18. I was like, I had to work. Like, it was not something that my parents like tried to get me to stop, but it was like, where's the money coming from?
I'm not going to do it, who's going to do it?
Exactly. Then I'm like, my parents are doing everything they can, but I'm like, there's some way I can help too. But if you don't have that personality, or if you don't have that environment, that is so important. If you don't have that environment where there's a need for you to be somewhere, like in a very important place, like work,
right?
That kid can come out in a way where they just don't feel resourceful. They feel like, well, why do I have to go out? Dad and mom make good money. I don't have to pay for this toy that comes out. They can buy it.
Right.
That's the difference right there. And that little stem that comes out at the age of 4 or 5, they will learn that and pick that up like nothing else.
Well, yeah, there's like that category of kids.
Yeah.
And then there's like the ones, I find that with the ones whose families do have money, there's 2 branches. There's the kids who grow up to be like, I can call my daddy and he'll pay me and do all this other stuff. And do you know who I am kind of kid? And like, I don't have to worry about that because my college is paid for, like, I'm a trust fund kid. Maybe not quite that big, but like, you get it. Then there's like the other kids who are like, I'm not the rich one. My parents are. I have nothing, so I have to work for it. My parents pay for my education. They pay for the roof over my head, and they pay for things that I'm interested in because I'm this old and I don't have a bank account. So my parents pay and provide for what I need because of my age. And those are the kids who are like, they're my favorites.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, what it is to like have that privilege of like not having to worry about a lot of stuff, but you're also like a good human being, which I always make a big deal to my kids of like, if you're going to do nothing else here, just be a decent human. Like, being a decent human being will take you so much farther in your life than being a sack of potatoes. And obviously, I would say something else, but when you're talking to kids, you can't tell them, like, otherwise you're going to be bleep, 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 like whatever. And most of them are like, okay, whatever, And it's just so hard because the ones that get it. And the ones that don't, it's kind of like you can't take a horse to water and make it drink. But it's like, why won't you listen to me kind of thing. Like, I'm an adult. I'm telling you what the world is like, and you still won't listen. Like,
It's such a tough
it is.
situation. It really is, especially for those people, because again, until you lose something, that's when you truly know what you lost and how grateful you are
Right.
for that. That's just how it is. Like, that's us humans. Like, we're
Right.
just selfish. So, especially as a kid or as a teenager, when you grew up with an iPad, then how are you supposed to how are you going to compare with not having an iPad? You don't know
Right.
how it feels to not have an iPad.
Right.
That's exactly how it is.
Yeah.
But yeah, like with these kids, it all comes back from the parents at the end of the day. That is the whole conversation that we're having. It's like they don't just learn it all of a sudden.
Yeah.
They're not born that way.
Right.
They're born kind.
Right.
They're born normal
Mhm.
for the most part. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, it's like
You could have a whole Freudian debate about it. All
Exactly.
this other stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, it comes down to how they're parented at home, if they're receiving attention at home.
Yeah.
Whether their needs are being fulfilled, and if
Mhm.
they're not, they're gonna get it somehow.
Oh yeah. And I have a colleague, a friend, and his daughters are getting ready for pre-K,
Mhm.
whatever the case is, and they don't really socialize with other kids. And the parents think that that's okay, because they socialize with the parents. The parents work at home. Great, But then I start to interact with the kids, or somebody does, and I notice that they don't want to talk. They're very
Right.
shy, which is
Right.
okay. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I start to wonder that when they come to that point of when they're in kindergarten or whatnot, how are they going to interact with other people if they've never interacted with kids their age, or you know what I mean?
Right.
And you have to start them off early.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens? Because you delay that stage when they're only social with adults. That's how it goes.
Yeah.
So it's kind of scary.
Yeah.
That's just one example. Whenever you talk about how kids react, I'm like, it all comes back from the parents one
Yeah.
way or another.
It does. It starts super early, and you have kids that are I've taught kids who I've definitely thought, I'm like, you were born in another decade and
Mhm.
reincarnated, because there is no way that a child your age has the maturity and the skills that you do. And then there are other kids that's like, what barn were you raised in?
Right.
Because you don't know how to do anything.
Agreed.
Some kids are, in middle school, they're notoriously horrible for figuring out conflict and all of that other stuff, because they're learning all of these skills as they go.
Right.
But most of them, hopefully, kind of figure it out, and they're like, oh, I can't just be really ridiculous in front of people. There's a certain way that I have to communicate with people. And there's kids who learn that, and then there's kids who don't.
Yep.
And the ones who don't are the ones who get in trouble, and the ones who are behavior on behavior on behavior, And so that's another thing they don't teach you in teacher college,
Mhm.
or that the textbooks don't teach you, is how to deal with behavior. You could learn about educational theory and what looks best in practice, and collaboration, and student engagement, and read all about building relationships with kids. And then you're thrown into your own classroom and you're like, what do I do? Classroom management is something totally different.
Mhm.
My first year teaching, I was at my computer. And when we went back to hybrid, I had literally I think my biggest class, I had 10 kids in the room. And they're all on their computers working on digital work. So there's no behaviors to manage. They're all just chilling. The biggest thing you have to worry about is hey, Johnny, you need to not be playing your silly little Minecraft game while I'm trying to teach you. You have to email the parent saying hey, so-and-so's just there's this uptick in playing games during instruction. It really takes away from his understanding, blah, 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 blah. It can affect his grades. And then my second year teaching, all the kids came back. So I was basically a first year teacher all over again. Because you're okay, I've taught this content for 1 year, but now I'm teaching this content and I have behaviors to worry about, because I have 34 kids in a class. And then you bring in the fact there's 34 kids in your class and they're all 14 years old. Most of them are taller than you, and they're all unsocialized. And it's chaos within a dumpster fire. And it's crazy, because you know what you should do,
Mhm.
but then actually doing that, because like there were a lot of days where I was like, I know I need to give this kid a consequence, but like I feel bad.
Right.
And like learning to not feel bad when you're giving a kid a consequence, because it's like, no, you pissed me off. Like I should give you a consequence, but like I don't like confrontation and like writing that consequence for the kid. Or then you have the kids that gaslight you and they're like, I didn't even do that. I don't know what you're talking about. Like, why would you give me a step? Oh my God, my dad's gonna be so mad at me, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, okay, well, you should have thought of that before you did X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
So like my first year teaching, I was really, really bad with following through on consequences and following through on discipline. So like my teammates, they were really nice about it, but I'm sure they were pissed off at me because they were like, damn it. Like I'm doing all this stuff and giving these kids consequences. But when they go to Miss K's class, they know they can do whatever the heck they want because she's all about building relationships with the kids and is horrible with discipline, which I will admit I was. But now I'm kind of like in a place where, yes, I will build relationships with you to the moon and back. But also, if you do something that deserves a consequence, you're going to get the consequence.
Right. Yeah. That sounds about right. I mean,
Right.
it's a learning experience from
Right.
that for both people,
Right.
for the kid and for you. It's just kind of like you have to find your teaching method.
Right.
That's just how it is.
Yeah. You have to find your teaching method and like your teaching style and all of that. And there's a lot of people who are like really old school. Like, I love her.
Yes.
She's super old school.
Oh, is she?
She's
Okay.
so old school, which I love sometimes, where I'm like, come deal with this kid and she'll do it. But then there's teachers like me who are younger who like, there are some old school like methods that I appreciate, but there's a lot of old school methods where I'm like, I don't really like that, you know? But then there are some days where you're like, okay, all of my teammates are old school teachers and I have to be consistent. So I also have to be like sort of old school, but also staying true to like my not old school self, you know? So it's just interesting because your teaching style can be one way, but then it has to change and like be molded to a certain thing when you work with a certain group of teachers. Because if you have a team of teachers, especially in like middle school, when kids go from one content to one content to one content, if the team isn't consistent, the whole thing crashes and burns.
Right.
Because then kids are like, oh, I have to act this way in one person's classroom, but then once I go to this classroom, I can do whatever the hell I want.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And then it's horrible.
I agree with that. That's something that I was looking to like kind of check in with you
Right.
about. But when you have a kid, right, who's just they're off the walls,
Right.
you know, and you don't know how to teach them a certain way, or you don't know how they learn because
Right.
clearly your methods aren't working with that. How do you adjust to that? Like, do you go to different colleagues and talk to them, or do you go find external resources?
It really depends on kind of what the behavior is or
Mm.
what the kid is doing. So like with some kids, it's as easy as holding them after class, sitting them down and being like, I'm going to be very honest with you and I'm going to talk to you like you're an adult because I know that's what you want. And I'm just going to ask you a very simple question. I want you to answer it honestly. Like, what is the deal? What's wrong with you?
Mm-hmm.
How can I help you? What do you need in this classroom? Because from what I'm seeing, I can't do my job if you're doing X, Y, and Z.
Right.
And some kids are like, I did not realize that I was doing that. I'm really sorry. Here's what I need. Then there are some kids that are like, yeah, I get you're trying to do a job. I don't care. I'm going to still do what I want to do. And you're like, okay, well, can we meet in the middle and come to a compromise where you let me do my job and then I'll give you time to be yourself within certain parameters.
Right.
And I've had most of my kids fall into one of those two categories where I'm like, okay, I can handle this. And then every once in a while, you get one or two, depending on what the school year is like. I had one girl my second year teaching. We'll call her Natalie.
Nice.
And Natalie, that girl was a piece of work. That's the nice way to put it.
Okay.
She had a reputation coming in, and the kids had a nickname for her already that was not a nice one. She was mean. She was disrespectful. She was loud. She was like up in your face. She was just something else.
Mm-hmm.
And she was always at school. And it's the kid that you want to be absent, who's never absent. So she was there every single day. And the days that she wasn't, it was like, oh my God, I can breathe. Like, There's peace. Is this what it's supposed to be like? But she was just like, none of the strategies would work at all. Like, I was kind of really, really frustrated with her because I put so much effort into like getting to know her. I put so much effort into trying all these different strategies with her. And I'm pretty sure that child was a psychopath. Like, she was manipulative and was just like, oh yeah, sure, I'll work on that. And it would last for about 2 days.
Mm-hmm.
And then it'd just be right back in the cycle. Like, they don't teach you how to deal with a kid who just decides that they're just going to pick up their stuff and walk out of the room in the middle of your lesson, or is just super disrespectful. Like I've had disrespectful kids before, but this girl, I was like, how do you feel comfortable talking to anybody like that, whether it's your peers or like whatever? And she was just like, to the point where you were just uncomfortable being around her because you knew that she would do anything to get anybody's attention, good or bad.
Right.
And so finally it was just kind of like, you never want to like get to a point where you feel like you have to give up on a kid, because that's like the worst thing ever. You're like, I don't want to give up on a kid. But with Natalie, I gave up on her. I had to.
Right.
There was no other way for me to like do my job effectively and like hold myself together also without being like, I'm done with you.
Yep.
I'm done. And then she was like, what? Why are you done? Because she was so like, she would feed off of all the negativity. It was like, ugh, so awful.
Yeah.
She ended up getting kicked out, like paneled basically.
Oh, wow.
She like, yeah, she kind of like, I won't go into detail with what it was, but she, got physical with a teacher, and it was this whole like altercation kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it was just like, it was just weird because you feel sad to a point where you're like, what is your home life like that you feel like that's the only way that you can get attention? And the worst thing for me was that this girl was so smart. Like, she's brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it would have been amazing to like study her brain to be like, what goes on in Natalie's brain? Because Natalie is so smart. Like,
right.
But she was using that smart and that like brilliance for cunning and for like conniving and for manipulating, like all the things that you do not need in a classroom full of unsocialized, ridiculous 8th graders.
Yeah.
And then you add social media on top of that, and it's all this stuff. So like they don't teach you how to deal with that. And like with that, I had to like ask my colleagues. I was like, have you ever had to deal with a kid like this? What do you do in that situation? And they would tell me, like, this is the strategy that I've been using with her. It sort of kind of works, but we're just kind of going with it because it's all I can do to not, like, lose my mind.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had to pretty much go to my admin and be like, you have to deal with her because I have 36 kids I have to teach. My class is waiting on me. I do not have the time or energy to deal with this. Be like, you take her. And it was to the point where, like, it literally was like, go see the AP. I'm done with you. Goodbye.
Right.
Get out. Like, it's just like at that point, it's exhausting.
Mm-hmm.
Exhausting because it's every day. And it's like, it's also horrible because it's not that you're just dealing with that one kid every day. It's not like where it's you and me and I'm sitting in a room and like Natalie's sitting across from me being like horrible. She's being horrible in a room full of like 25 kids where they're all looking at her because she has them all wrapped around her finger. And so they're all looking at her and then they're all looking at you. Like, all right, Miss K, what are you going to do? What's Natalie going to do? What are you going to do? So it's this like showdown every day. And you're just like, oh my God, I just need this to end. Like, somebody come get this girl. Please.
Right. Yeah.
And it's just like, thank goodness I don't have any kids like that this year. Because if I did, I don't think I'd make it.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a certain point, where the limit comes by.
Yeah.
So because you didn't really have that in the textbook of, hey, how do I deal with this kid?
Right.
How did you learn that over time, that this is how you deal with X, Y, and Z kid?
It's just like a trial and error kind of thing. A lot of behavior management, I feel like, is trial and error. It's either trial and error or you go and literally like survey other people and are like, what do you usually do in your classroom?
Right.
Because like I have no idea what to do with this kind of kid. And it just kind of boils down to like what you feel is best in the moment. And it also boils down to like how supportive your supervisors are.
Yeah.
So like at my school, you know, like in Gwinnett County, they all have the little white button that you can press to call the front office. I haven't had to use that button yet. But I know plenty of people who, if they have a kid who's like really like that, and last year with her, I probably should have used that button. I didn't because I didn't want to like give her, you know, the power with all that. But you could push that button at my school and say, hi, I need an administrator in my classroom right now. And an administrator will march down and say, what do you need? You can say, I need you to take so-and-so out of my classroom because they're being disruptive and I am unable to do my job. And they'll take that kid out, and that kid, I don't care what happens after that. I'm just like, all right, everybody, turn back to whatever we were doing. You're getting your stuff done. But at a lot of schools, it's not like that. A lot of schools, they'll be like, oh yeah, sure, we'll take the kid out. They'll be like, Natalie, you know better than that. You should be good. Here's a lollipop for your time. Go back to class.
Wow.
Yep. And then they come back and they're like, I got a lollipop. You know, like that kind of thing where it's like, oh my God, are you serious? Thankfully, I don't have those kids. And Natalie wasn't that kind of situation because I had a really supportive administrator. But like, you really just have to like feel it out. And it depends on kind of what policies your school has in place, discipline-wise and kind of like expectations-wise. Because if your admin is all like all together on kind of what's expected of kids, how discipline is going to be handled, like what's absolutely unacceptable and what's like towing the line kind of thing, it makes it really easy. Like right now in Gwinnett County, there's no discipline because our superintendent is focused on restorative practices. So he's all about like everybody holding hands and singing kumbaya instead of like, hey, your kid kind of sucks and like they need a consequence.
Right.
So it's like, that's a whole other thing. But so there's no discipline right now. And so the kids have no accountability. They know they're not going to be held accountable for anything they do. Thankfully, again, I have administrators that will be like, no, we're going to give consequences. And so you can give consequences in your classroom and also know that like if the kid goes beyond what you are capable of and beyond what you know you can handle in your classroom, you can push that button or you can go across the hall and say, come get this kid.
Yep.
Please. And that's where I'm like really fortunate of where I am, but a lot of schools are not like that.
Yeah. And that's the unfortunate part about it. That's where you're right. There's such a big imbalance. And so it's kind of hard to tell what somebody does at Gwinnett County versus Cobb County.
And that's where it's like, like what I said before, like that uniformity is all on paper, but it's not in practice.
Yep. And that's the scary part about it. But that's where the shortage of physicians, teachers, nurses, this is where what happens. Like you start to deal with the complex parts of it, and people don't like to address that up ahead. And it's the people higher, it's not the people who are working, it's the people who are above them who've never taught a day in their life, who have never practiced medicine a day in their life. It's those administrators that make those voices suppressed.
Exactly.
So it's a big problem.
Exactly. And I have been very honest with my students about that before. Like, tell you about literally yesterday. We're giving like this little formative assessment or like this little like an interim exam kind of. And there's a question on it that none of us like because it's poorly written and it's written assuming that 7th graders have knowledge about this certain topic, which most 7th graders don't. So we're on our evolution unit. I teach like life science, everything like that. So the question is talking about like moles, like the rodent that lives underground, and like how they're adapted to have this wicked sense of smell in order to find their food. And their food is worms. And so they talk about like the whole thing is that as your environment changes, you as an organism have to adapt, otherwise you die. And so they know that because we've told that to them many times. But the question is talking about if there's more rainfall in the environment, what are the worms going to do? And then how is that going to affect the mole's sense of smell? But it's like super stupid because they assume that 7th graders know the mechanics of like worms.
Right.
And like their instincts as far as like what happens when it rains.
Yeah.
Most kids don't care
Right.
about that. They don't know that. Like if I were to guide them through it, they're able to answer it.
Right.
But if I just throw that question in front of you, they're going to miss it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I told them, I said, I hate this question, but this question's on your test. So you have to just remember the answer that I tell you and why it's that answer so that you get it right on the test.
Right.
And they're like, well, why is this question even in here? And I was like, well, darling children, this is what happens when people who have never taught a day in their life make tests.
Right.
And this is what happens when people assume that 12 and 13-year-olds know things about the world that they don't.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're thinking, I'm an adult, I know about this, so surely this 12-year-old knows about this. That's not the case. And it's so ridiculous. And it goes with so many fields, like what you're saying, like nursing, physicians, anything of like, how is it, or like politicians even, like with our government, like how is it that these people who have never actually like practiced this career are able to be in like such levels of power to where they're able to make these influential decisions that are horrible for everyone involved, except for them.
Yep.
You know? So it's just a pain.
It's a lack of understanding.
A lack of understanding is really good.
That's what it is.
We had the end of last school year, I don't know if you saw it about the whole thing with the teacher who basically like went off on the Gwinnett County board.
No.
So there was a teacher at the end of last school year who resigned, but made like a really big deal of it and went to the board meeting and basically told the board like get bent. He had said, he was like, kids are disrespectful, kids aren't held accountable, and administration doesn't care. Administrators are out of touch. The people at the county level are out of touch. And he was like, it should be standard practice that administrators who have been out of the classroom for more than 10 years, like, go somewhere to go be a substitute for a whole day or even a whole week. They're stripped of their titles. You're not an assistant principal. You don't have a name tag. You go somewhere where people don't know who you are. You go to kids who literally could not give less of a fuck who you are.
Right.
And you should sit in a class and be a substitute with these types of kids for a week plus. Then come back and tell me that I'm not effective at my job or that you continue to know what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And like, my administration's great, but most of them have not been in the classroom for probably a decade, if not more. And education changes so quickly that in 10 years, you've gone from everything being paper pencil to like minimal desktop computer interaction.
Yep.
To like all these kids are one-to-one with a Chromebook and you're having to deal with like, are the kids playing Minecraft or are they looking up on the computer?
Right. Yeah.
You know?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, and then the administrators are like, okay, well, have you tried building relationships with this student? And I'm like, what? Yes, of course I have. Like, that's the first thing I do. Well, that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is this kid is like, this is what's going on and you're not getting it.
Yeah.
So it's the lack of understanding. It's the being out of touch and just the sheer amount of like not trusting professionals to be professionals.
Yeah. And it's unfortunate, right? Like that you bring that up because that is part of the problem. When they're out of touch, a lot of times these board members are old. They're in senior status, right? So they are well respected, which is great. But at the same time, they were at a time in their lives where segregation also was part of that. And I'm not talking about like 1950s and all that stuff.
Right.
But even segregation today, like we're starting to finally understand that diversity is huge into what our community is. But the people who are on those board members, they were there.
They're not
20
diverse.
years ago.
They all look the same.
20 years ago, 30 years ago, they do all look the same. And we know what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But even 20 years ago, that was a different time from what's today. Today is a very sensitive time, a very educated time to really be looking at these kids. 20 years ago, you could call any racist comments you want, and people were fine with that. 20 years ago, terrorist attacks were out there. There are just many things that we don't want to, talk about. We're just very uncomfortable with. But those board members don't realize that 20 years now, it's a different story.
Right.
There's a black kid in school who's taking care of three of their brothers and sisters because their mom and dad have to go to work.
Right.
We don't want to talk about that, though.
Right.
Or-
I've noticed a lot of that, like, especially with some of like the older teachers at my school. So I'm the youngest teacher at my school,
Mhm.
25. Everybody at my school is older than me. Some of the younger teachers are like, we're all in our 20s, but they're like 27, 28, kind of that kind of thing. So we're all kind of in the same ballpark. But then I have teachers who are like in their 60s. And so like, it's so weird because you still have teachers who, when they're talking about students and their demographics, will be like, I teach this black kid.
Yeah, right.
And I'm like, you can say it.
Yeah.
You can say, I teach a black kid.
Yeah.
Or I teach a Latina child. Or I
Yeah.
teach whatever the kid, a white kid,
Yeah.
whatever. You don't have to whisper it. It's not
Yeah.
a slur. Like, but they're like, some people, they'll say things. And I'm like,
Yeah.
did you hear that? Because I heard that, Or sometimes I'll be like, there's actually a new word for that. You should really think about like this kid is doing X, Y, and Z because of this,
Sure.
And so not only are you educating kids, sometimes you're educating other adults too.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's important. I'm glad that you brought that up because people bring up the topics. And yes, it's different for everybody, but a black kid's a black kid, a
Right.
Latina's a Latina, a Pakistani's a Pakistani, a
Right.
Muslim's a Muslim,
Right.
whatever you want to call it, an Asian's an Asian. Now, if you start doing that and start whispering that what their race is,
Right.
you're drawing more attention to that
Right.
than just calling it like it is.
Right.
If you make a rhetoric towards it or you have a tone towards it that's different, then yeah, you're doing it wrong, obviously. But if you want to be inclusive, you just say it like it is.
Well, and it's also funny because the teachers who are usually like that are the ones that generally have problems with students in that demographic.
Yeah.
Because students within those demographics didn't just wake up one day and they were like, oh, I'm no longer this demographic.
Yeah.
Like, they've been in that skin their whole lives. They've probably gone through multiple situations where they've been stereotyped or, marginalized in some way or another. So they're not unused to it. They know kind of what's going on, and it's like they smell the fear.
Yeah.
They can pick it out. They walk in, they're like, here we are, that one, and these teachers don't get it. So like, I try to be like, okay, I obviously don't know about your culture. Would you do me a favor and tell me about it? Because when I
There you
have
go.
kids, obviously you're not going to be the only Pakistani kid in my class, or you're not
Mhm.
going to be the only hijabi kid that I teach.
Exactly.
Like, I would love to know more about this so that when I come into another situation like this, like if I have a kid who her hijab falls off because her pins got pulled out or whatever, I'm like, okay, I know how to handle this.
Yeah.
Instead of being like, oh my God, kid, look at it,
yeah. Right.
And so having the kids educate you about that is the best part because they're the closest ones to it.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of like trying to assume that you know somebody's culture or like what they should be doing because that's what you're used to. Like, that's where the disconnect is, and kids do not vibe with people they don't like. And if they don't like you, they're going to make it known.
Oh, shit.
They're going to make it known.
Yeah.
Like, they're going to make, they are. And so if you want to have like those good relationships or have a flowing classroom environment, you're going to have to get a little uncomfortable sometimes, especially if you're not used to it. And some people don't.
That's funny that you bring that up. Anytime as a kid or when I was a teenager in college, whatever the case is, that I was talking to a white person, right? I would be skeptical because of the rhetorics that I had beforehand, the racial profiles that people have listed, right? And
Right.
I was okay with that. Just like you said, these kids, they grow up to be understanding. They brush it off their shoulders like nothing else. And 9 times out of 10, whenever somebody asked me in an honest way and they said, what does a Muslim do? What does a Pakistani do? I truly don't know. Can you, teach me a little bit more about it? I respected them like all the way because they just asked me in a blunt way, hey, I don't know about this, but can you teach me?
Right.
They may have had like a really stern tone with it. I still respected it because I was like, listen, look at you.
At least you're being honest with me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was like, it's different when it comes from a sincerity. We feel the sincerity. We know when you're asking a question because you are in a different belief system and you're just trying to pick on somebody, Whereas if somebody says, I don't know, but can you teach me?
Right.
It's a different tone when I'm saying it, It's like, that's all it takes. These kids are not dumb.
No.
These kids will catch you real quick.
Exactly.
And you
that's
might
what
catch
a
their
lot of
hands,
people
too.
don't understand is that there are some kids who I'm like, wow, you're dumb. And they actually are dumb. But there are a lot of kids who are not. Most of them are not.
Right.
And it's just like the amount of and the whole demographic with teachers is changing as well, because as younger people become teachers, and hopefully we have younger teachers that continue to become teachers,
Right,
or continue like come into the field, change everything. But with a lot of older teachers, it'll be kind of like, making these assumptions of like, oh, well, I have like 2 Black friends, so obviously I know what I'm talking about. And it's like, no, really, you don't. Like, I've never had a kid who, actually, I do. We have a couple of kids who have to take time out of the period to go and pray.
Yeah.
They're not in my class period, so I don't deal with it directly, but I see them leave at the same time every day, and they go to the designated area in our school, and they go and do their thing, and then they come back from class. But then there are like other kids who, like when Ramadan happens and I have all my kids who are fasting, if we're doing an activity that has to do with food, like last year when I taught 8th grade, we had this like Skittles lab with like Half-Life, and I had to figure something else out because I had a kid who literally couldn't eat.
right.
So I was like, okay, well, I don't want so-and-so to feel left out just because they can't eat. So I would go and talk to them and be like, hey, what are the dates for Ramadan? And if we're doing a lab or something that has this, like, we're going to have food. I want to tell you that. And I don't want you to feel like uncomfortable or that you're being left out. So like, is there a way that I can adjust it for you to where you still feel included or like whatever? And I had one kid who was like, I'll just eat them. I was like, are you sure? He was like, yeah, it'll be all right. They'll forgive me. I was like, okay, as long as you're the one that's saying that, like, that's all right. But, some of them are like, oh, I've never thought about that because no one's ever asked me, you know?
Yep. And that's, that makes me emotional. Thank you. I appreciate that. I never had that like in high school. So it's amazing to have somebody who like understands, what I wish I had, but I'm so glad that the students have some type of person that they could go to when this happens in the future,
Right.
Because that's important. Like that is such a big thing. Like we forget that, and that's very nice. I'm very speechless for what you just said. That like gave me goosebumps.
Oh,
that's really awesome. Thank you for doing that. I really appreciate that. For whoever that kid is, they're lucky.
Yeah. Well, I had a couple kids last year who like literally got into an argument of when the Ramadan dates were.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, but like, can we agree on when it starts and like general ballpark of when it ends? And they were like, oh yeah, it's like this day.
That's funny.
But yeah, it doesn't go along with just that. But like, there's, tons of other things that you can do to be like culturally responsive in the way that you run your classroom. And to me, it's like easy as pie. It's like, okay, whatever. All it takes is asking a very simple question and taking a couple minutes of your time to listen to that kid's response. Or even calling the parent and saying, hi, I'm so-and-so. I'd like to learn about whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if the kid like isn't comfortable, but most of the kids I've talked to are like, whoa. They'll talk about it.
Yeah.
But it literally takes seconds, if not minutes, to do that. And like sometimes I'm genuinely baffled by the amount of people who are so resistant to it. So I'm like, it doesn't take that much time or effort. And the amount of effort and time that you're putting into being resistant to it, you could have already figured out all this stuff about all these kids that you're complaining about.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that hard.
I agree. And those kids are talking because you made them comfortable, just so you know. Like that, it's because of you that they're willing to talk more, because um that's how it is. Like
Right.
I didn't want to talk about this in high school and middle school, because I was like, who wants to listen to my problems, or like not my problems, but like my life, when
Right.
this Americanized, westernized world is not the same as mine.
Right.
But you're opening that up for those people to talk about it, so that's
No, I
a big part as a
love
teacher.
talking to my kids about all of their backgrounds. Like
Yep.
I have, especially since I teach ESOL, I have a lot of kids who are Hispanic.
Yeah.
And so like I have some colleagues who, for whatever reason, I mean, I kind of know what the reasons are, but they don't like when these kids talk in Spanish in the classroom. And part of that is because the kids will curse in Spanish because they're like, my white teacher doesn't know what this is doing, blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah, blah. I had one kid literally last week who said the equivalent of in Spanish. And she said it to another kid. And I was literally like, hey, I don't like your language. And she looked at me like, what? You know Spanish? I was like, I know enough to know that word you just said is not a nice one and you should not use it again. Otherwise, I'm going to have to write you up. Do you
Right.
understand me? She was like, yeah, I got it, Miss K. I was like, okay, thank you. And the only reason for that is because I had a kid the year before who, like, I literally was forced to learn all the Spanish curse words, because if I didn't, Samuel was going to say something that was going to offend somebody, or he was going to say something really nasty in Spanish that nobody needed to hear. So I had to learn all those words. And now I'm like, they're like, oh, you know Spanish, Miss K? And I'm like, well, I know enough to say, hi, how are you? What else? Yes, no, good, bad. And I know pretty much all the curse words. So don't try those in here. And they're like, okay, like whatever. And sometimes I'll even be like, I'll ask them to teach me a little bit. I'm like, how do you, like, what's the word for this? And they're like, oh, it's this. It's just like fun to like have that little learning moment, because they enjoy teaching people about other things, they enjoy somebody asking them about that. And so like when I have people who tell me like, why do you let those kids talk in Spanish in your classroom? I'm like, because it's their mother tongue and it's like a language that they're fluent in. And like, why am I going to like, they speak English enough to get by, and like they obviously are going to respond to me in English, but like why would I take that comfort away from them?
Yep.
Like I'll tell them, I'm like, hey, I'm going to let you keep doing this until the words I start hearing are words that I know you should not be saying. And once we get to that point, then we're going to limit it.
Yeah.
But like until then, you just have to know I'm going to be listening to what you're saying. And if I suspect that anything is not what it's supposed to be in a middle school classroom, then we'll be good. Like we'll be good until that point. And usually they're like, okay, like whatever. And so they'll be doing their work, or they're just like going back and forth and whatnot. And at lunch they talk and whatever. And so people are like, I don't like that they do that. I was like, okay, well, I don't care.
Right.
It's my class right now. They're not in your class. When they're in your class, you can tell them they can't speak in Spanish. But I'm not going to do that because that makes me uncomfortable. And it for sure is going to make them not like me. And kids don't learn from people they don't like.
Yep.
And I'd like for them to learn from me. So that's what I'm going to do. Thanks.
Yeah, you're making a big difference. That's which is amazing. I appreciate that so much.
Thank you.
So to wrap this up, to really, because we had some great conversations.
Yeah.
What are some of the advices that you have for somebody who's looking to go into teaching, or that is in teaching right now and can maybe learn from your methods? You have a lot to learn as well, as we noted, but what are some of these topics or advices that you want to give?
Well, if you're looking to go into teaching, just know that the student teaching process is very strenuous and you do not get paid. You will be working full-time for free, pretty much, depending on what state you're in and what school you go to. Like my student teaching experience was a whole school year, Monday through Friday, the entire school day, didn't get paid, so you will be broke. And then for people who are still looking to get into teaching, it's really fun. I know a lot of people will be like, oh my God, you're so brave for going into education, or depending on what grade level you're going into. Like every time I tell people I'm a middle school teacher, like, how do you do it? I'm like, I just do it because I don't want to teach elementary school or like whatever else it is. But like, don't let anybody shit on you for doing what you like. Like if you, like, I love teaching. I don't like that I don't get paid enough, and I don't like that I get stomped on by other adults sometimes. And I certainly don't like when kids make my day horrible and like traumatize me. But at the end of the day, when I think of like the 99% of kids that I have that are really, really great, and that's that 1% that makes your life a living hell, you just have to think about the 99%, and it's a lot easier said than done. But like those kids are really great. And for people who are like already in teaching, like maintaining a decent work-life balance is really important. And I know that that is so easy to say and so hard to do. And like overcoming from burnout is like the hardest thing to do ever. But like take your breaks, literally don't do anything. Don't take your work computer home. Don't answer emails on the weekend. Those parents, send those to your administrator. And take your full summers. Don't teach summer school unless you absolutely need to. If you need that check for the summer school, do it. But otherwise, so they can find somebody else. And take your mental health days. Because you have the time. Your admin's going to tell you, no, you can't take it off. Take it off. But yeah, I mean, because we need good teachers. And if we don't have good teachers, it's going to get to a point where we just have a warm body in the classroom. And the system's already broken. We don't need it even worse. And if we get to a point where there literally are no qualified teachers, I don't even know what it's going to be, which makes me sad to think about. Because I would hate to have to teach alongside somebody who literally has their head up their ass, but who knows? It might get to that point. I really hope it doesn't with the way that everything's going. But yeah. That's what I would say.
I think it's important that you bring that up of your colleagues who you'll be having in the future, because you're right. You're doing everything you can as a teacher. You're trying to respect the students and kind of go from there, but you also need some help from your next colleagues who are coming in this next future generation. And you're right. Like I'm hoping this podcast will help people really understand if teaching is something they should look further into, by your experiences, and kind of going from there. And you've shown some pros with it, like there are a lot of pros to it as well. If you can withhold the cons that come with it,
It is not for the weak.
It's not. No,
it's not.
No, there's a lot of positions like that, that are important. So, I cannot thank you enough for coming on this podcast and like sharing your story and just being honest. You know, just people don't get to hear much about what a teacher's day's life is like, especially a new teacher who has been through the new system.
Right.
20 years ago, that was different. We're talking about now.
Right.
And you've done that. So hopefully if anybody wants to contact you, we'll leave some information below, we'll figure out something, we'll leave it in the description and kind of go from there.
Yeah. It's a very rewarding field. It's definitely a very difficult job, but it's really fun. If you do it right, it can be really fun.
Yeah, well, you'll be teaching my kids soon, so soon as in later in life,
right? We'll see.
But we'll get there. So, but I appreciate you coming on this podcast, Lacey.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely.